The Douglas Coleman Show is made possible with support from Seth David Radwell, a recent guest on the program and author of American Schism, How the Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to Healing Our Nation, released this past July. As Publishers Weekly writes in its recent glowing book life review of American Schism, business executive Radwell's epic debut examines the historical influences that have led to what he sees as the collapse of politics in the United States. Seth Radwell makes the case that the current chasm between the American right and left can be traced back to the 18th century's Age of Enlightenment and the basic tenets of liberty, equality, and reason. American Schism provides a historical perspective that can help us fight today's unreason with reason and bridge current-day divides. American Schism by Seth David Radwell is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and wherever books are sold. For more information, go to AmericanSchismBook.com.
It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Conrad Cecil. Hello, Conrad. How are you?
Good. Thank you, Douglas. And thank you very much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for coming on. I was just looking at the email thread that was sent through my producer, John, and you came through Carrie, right?
That's right. Carrie Nacina. Indeed. Yeah. And all-round kind of magic wand waver, really. She's a very fine actress and a very competent producer. But one of the things she does is she connects people. And, she connected us, and I've seen she's connected many people together. I listened to your interview with Dana Lynn Barron, who's in Being the Ricardos, and really enjoyed that conversation you guys had about Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz and all that.
I was really excited to have her on because I'm such a big I Love Lucy fan, and
right, I got that.
Yeah.
It was really interesting. I mean, when I realized, there's a depth of, let's say, fanness with I Love Lucy that's really strong. I mean, I didn't realize how, and I've been getting more aware of that since this movie came out.
Well, it was probably not, now you grew up in England, right?
Correct.
It probably wasn't as big over there, although...
Not as big, no.
Yeah. I was trying to think, there were some American TV shows that were huge in England, like Dallas.
Oh, God. Dynasty, Dallas.
Right.
I mean, all these things that ran, through the... Well, really, I mean, they still get a lot of import, but not I Love Lucy, at least not in my generation. I mean, the 80s, late 70s, all of that, when I was a kid, I wasn't exposed to that, so...
Well, I have to wonder, I mean, Lucy was one of the first television shows in existence. And I have to wonder how many people in Britain had television in 1952.
Good question. And yeah, I cannot tell you. It can't have been that widespread.
No, and they were very expensive when they first came out, and a lot of people just couldn't afford them. Right. I think people were still keen on their radios at that point.
Yes, actually, it's interesting because radio, I don't know how it is to you now, but, when I was at theater school in 2000, we had radio class, I mean, that's really, it still kind of blows my mind. I mean, it's only 20 years ago, and we still had radio class, and basically we all took that technique and adapted it for things like voiceover, things like that. It's not the same, but at least learning how to work with a microphone and all this kind of thing. So yeah, radio is still very big, and in Europe too. And I lived in France for a while, and my first job was in the radio. So
okay. Well, the one thing about voice training is that you can really apply it to anything.
Yes.
And these days, I mean, everybody and their mother is doing a podcast.
I know.
Which I don't even want to get into that because I wrote a book on that.
Did you?
Yeah, it's a very short book. It's only 23 pages. I call it a pamphlet. But It's just my sort of rant about that there's way too many people doing podcasts who really have no business doing a podcast. And the only reason that they do it is because they can.
Yeah.
Well,
it's a really interesting question because it speaks to a much bigger issue of our times, which is, the sort of, I don't want to say democratization because that's a kind of grandiose word, but everybody can get their hands on the media, let's say. So, there's good sides and bad sides, aren't there? I think it's fantastic that you can get direct reports of what's going on the ground in different parts of the world from somebody's phone. But I also think that we're inundated and there's no references anymore. So it's a chaotic time in the media, I think.
Well, absolutely. And you're right. It does sort of transcend through all the medias because on the one hand, you've got people producing shows on their phone. And on the other hand, you've got people producing shows on their phone.
Exactly. Well said.
It's just...
I just realized that because I subscribed to your YouTube channel a few weeks ago when we booked this, and so things come up, and there's this weird thing of the algorithm. So I got 2 days ago, I got your song All the Way on Love, and I thought it was you just dropped it. So I listened to it. It's a great song, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
Beautiful voice. And I didn't realize that you were a completely accomplished musician because I only knew you as a podcast host.
Oh, okay.
So congratulations on that, Douglas.
Thank you.
Really like that. And it was also quite a shock for me because I was like, wow, time has a different meaning because of algorithms. It's not just me who's going to go and look in your archive. I was just sitting there, open YouTube, and bang, this comes up as if you just dropped a new record. So there's something weird going on there as well.
Oh, that's, when did that come out? 2014, 15? Somewhere.
There you go. You see, but it literally dropped on my my feed 2 days ago.
Well, it's probably just because it's on my channel. It's at the very end of it. There's 500 and some odd podcasts on the channel. And then at the very end, I think there's 2 music videos that I did long ago.
Right.
And those were all produced by Stuart Epps, who...
Okay.
You know who he is?
No, but I've heard you mention... Because you had one of your one of your guests, a musician, I think you mentioned him, and he sounds like quite a character. Quite somebody in the business.
Well, see, I always thought that all the British knew each other, but he is Elton John's sort of original producer.
Sound engineer or producer, okay.
Yeah, he was, back then he was sort of apprentice.
Right.
He was apprentice to Gus Dudgeons, who produced all the early Elton John albums.
Got it.
Stuart met Elton at Dick James Music Publishers, who was the Beatles publisher. He worked there from 1967 on.
Right.
And this sort of scruffy kid came in whose name was Reg Dwight and had songs but he had no one to write lyrics, and the whole story of how they hooked up with Bernie Taupin and he became Elton John.
That's right.
Yeah.
Rocket Man.
So anyways, Stuart worked with Elton for a number of years, and many other people too, Oasis and
nice. Yeah.
So he produced songs.
He did that for you. Right. Yeah. It's really. Have you always been a musician, first and foremost?
Yeah, I started playing piano when I was about 3 years old, and then started writing probably when I was 14 or 15.
Wow. Yeah, I think you and my brother would have a lot to talk about. He's a music producer. He lives in Uganda, has a family. His family's out there and everything, and he knows all of the London scene and everything. And these kind of names would mean a lot to him. You're right that I think it's more about different scenes. So like in the music scene, yes, of course, everybody is going to know each other. But I've always been more on the theatre, film, TV, all of that kind of side of things. Not that I don't know music people, but not to the same extent.
Well, what I found interesting was that I saw an interview on Dick Cavett. It was an old one from the 70s. And he was interviewing Dudley Moore and Peter Cook.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Great. That must be quite an interview.
And they were talking about how British television at that time, that there were only about 10 actors.
Wow.
And they just circulated them around to all the various shows.
Yeah.
And I thought it was funny because I do see a lot of people popping up on shows that is, oh, wait a minute, he was in that other, and like that.
That's right. It's true. I mean, you can't say that doesn't happen in Hollywood. I mean, come on. We do see
that's
faces
true. Yeah.
over and over. But it is slightly different. It's not because the pool is small. It's because there are, these are big ticket names, obviously. But I think you're right. And in fact, I lived in France for some years, and I think that is still much more like that than, Britain and the British scene has become really big and vibrant, and a lot of the actors are coming over here and that kind of thing, but or have been for years. But in France, it's still like you describe. It's like it feels like there are only 10 actors, and they're in all of the TV shows and movies.
I think they were particularly referring to the BBC in those days,
right?
Where there was just this small pool of actors that they drew from every time they had a show.
Yeah, absolutely. Very good.
Well, segueing into acting, I wanted to ask you a little bit. You studied at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, and which is interesting because I studied at the American Academy of Dramatic Art.
Ah, AMDA. Very nice.
Yeah, in New York. And what I always found interesting, though, is everybody that I've ever interviewed who has gone to the Royal Academy, it's synonymous with Shakespeare.
Yes.
Where in New York, we didn't get 1 ounce of Shakespeare. None. 0. So
that's amazing. I'm surprised, actually.
I think something got lost in the crossing the pond. And, we never studied Shakespeare. I mean, you could if you wanted to, but there wasn't a specific class or anything. But I wanted to ask you, I mean, how much Shakespeare does one get when they go to the Royal Academy?
Okay, so to be really clear, so what I did my master's degree at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and King's College London in directing and dramaturgy, and so it was called text and performance, and it was mostly directors who were doing it. Some of us were actors or actors/directors. I did my actor training, and I carefully use the word training rather than studied, at East 15 Acting School it was in East 15, a part of East London, and it moved out to really the fringe of London to a bigger campus. And that's a very method acting place, although they also do quite a bit of Shakespeare there, but not as much. So I was at 2 schools. I had my actor training, where it was really, the boot camp, and, going through everything and very rigorous. And then a master's degree at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and King's College London. And I'd say 2/3 of it was at RADA. But they put us through all the classes that the actors go through, but it was a master's degree, and it had more of an angle on directing. So we did scenes from Shakespeare, we did scenes from Chekhov, we did all these classics, but it was a lot of the emphasis was on us to put up projects and use the resources there and get tuition from, to sort of bolster our project. So people would put on plays basically as their master's thesis in what we call fringe theaters, like off Broadway, or even off if that would exist. And we would use that very classical resource, which is RADA. So to enhance our shows or to make them even work. So I had the Cicely Berry, who was a famous voice teacher. One of the people who worked with her, Buddy Thomas, gave us a lot of Shakespeare class, and there were others. So I can't speak to the amount that the 3-year program get of Shakespeare, but we certainly got kind of almost like a palette offered to us, like an artist's palette of availability of resources. It was an incredible program, and a lot of really good people came out of that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I just wanted to be clear about that I was at 2 schools as an actor and then as a director. So. But I'm surprised that you didn't do Shakespeare at AMDA, because I'd have thought, just as being a theatre school, you would do a little bit just to cover the base.
Yeah, we didn't get any.
Right. Wow.
It was years. I didn't think about it at the time. I went there in the early 80s. But years later, I thought, why didn't we get Shakespeare? That just makes no sense. So I really don't know.
Yeah.
It could have been, they could do it now. They've changed directors for that school many times.
Right.
So it's possible that the person that was in charge of the school at that point just didn't like Shakespeare, or didn't feel it was necessary. I don't know.
I don't know. It's there's a lot of back and forth about relevance, and yet I think anybody who really loves Shakespeare sees that it's completely beyond a lot of sort of superficial notions of is it out of date or something like that. I mean, there are thorny issues in it. I mean, he certainly lived at a time that had different values and different social structure, but the struggles and the psychological truth is unbelievably strong. I mean, did you see the Tragedy of Macbeth with Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand, the Joel Coen's latest movie?
No, I have not.
I would recommend it. It's
okay.
But I mean, visually incredible and stylistically incredible. And then you've got these two powerhouse performances and the way they work together. And I mean, Frances McDormand is basically for me a masterclass every time I see her on screen. She's an incredible actress.
Yes.
And she's very much a theatre actress and very, very classical in her capacities. But she does all these very gritty contemporary stuff, movies, sort of Three Billboards and Fargo and all these kind of things. Nomadland,
What did you see the speaking of Shakespeare, did you see the Romeo and Juliet one that Leonardo DiCaprio
did?
Okay.
Yes.
What did you think of that?
I think it was really brilliant because I felt Baz Luhrmann, the director, I feel like he just loves Shakespeare, and it's like the language is just all the time so vivid and alive that I just rode on that wave, surfed that wave of, it felt like Venice Beach. I think it was a lot of it filmed down there, and this kind of that wildness, that adolescent energy of just anything. There's a kind of carnival energy. I think was very true to the play. There is a wildness in the play. There's a chaos in the play, and I think it works. I think it was good. What did you think of it?
Well, again, I think this probably is because I didn't study Shakespeare and I didn't have the foundation when I watched it. But I got very distracted by them speaking in the way that they were whilst at an LA gas station.
Gotcha.
It just didn't work for me,
I see, yeah. It's kind of out of sync in a weird way.
It's out of sync.
I get
That's
you.
a good way to
get
put
you.
it.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, Douglas, because I'm so steeped in Shakespeare because of some of the other things I've done since I trained. In fact, it got more as I went along, and I'll tell you about that as we go along. But I'm so steeped in it that it's almost like a language or part of my language. So I kind of almost don't notice. I mean, in a good way. Like, they're at the LA gas station and they're saying, "What ho," whatever. And I'm just, I forget that they're talking in a language that was spoken 500 years ago. So that's a kind of
I think that's a good point, and I think that that's sort of the way one needs to approach Shakespeare. Is they've got to just take it as a separate language, like you would learn Hungarian or something. Where
I guess,
yeah,
Sorry.
And if you looked at it that way and really understood it as a separate language, then it wouldn't matter where they are.
Well, there is that. I mean, I think the actor's job and the director's job is to make it fluid and fluent and transparent so that the audience aren't getting stuck on it. And yes, I think you kind of just follow it. I think you're right. It's a good way to look at it because then you're not getting hung up on, did they say that back then? Or, that kind of thing. You
don't get hung up on the semantics of it.
Right.
You really understand what they're the message.
Exactly.
They're trying to
convey.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's got to really carry you along. The stories are so, they're blinding stories. I mean, they just are, So actually, that's something that has really been a continuous sort of thread in my life.
Well, let me stay on this one for a minute. Do you have a favorite Shakespearean actor?
Actor or play?
Actor.
Yes. Ooh. Okay, let's just pick one. Wow, just really hard. I hate favorite. Okay. Wow. Gosh. Okay, I'm just going to pick. So an earlier one would be for me Richard Burton for the voice.
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
I mean, I can listen to him, sometimes I'll just go on YouTube and listen to him reading a poem or reciting a piece from Shakespeare, Richard II or something like that. And it's just, that's it. It's all constructed in the voice. You know how they used to say, well, go and hear a play. You didn't go and see a play.
Yeah.
So I'd say also Mark Rylance for sure. Do you know Mark Rylance?
No, I don't.
He actually won an Oscar as a supporting role in Bridge of Spies with Tom Hanks about some years ago. He was the director or the artistic director of the old Globe. They reconstructed the Globe Theatre. You remember in Shakespearean Love, that movie, they did it all in the Globe Theatre. So Shakespeare's original theatre made out of wood. Well, Mark Rylance is the original director there, and he's amazing. He had the same voice training that I was lucky enough to have from Barbara and Peter Bridgman. And this guy, he can have his back to the audience in an open air theatre and talk as loud as we're talking now and be heard, by the back row. It's just incredible. And he brought a lot of emotion to it as well. So I'd put him up there, and he's still very active. You'll see him popping up. He was in Don't Look Up recently. He was in Dunkirk. If you now I've given you his name, Mark Rylance, you'll see him pop up. I can assure you.
I will Google him.
Okay, very good. Well, so I would say them. Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say I'm so happy that Burton was the first one that you mentioned, because he is my favorite as well.
Oh, good.
As a Shakespearean, I could listen to his voice all day long.
Yeah, pure gold. Really.
The second one that I think, which a lot of people find sort of ironic, because there is this sort of snobbery. I don't know if it's still around, but it used to be, where they said only British actors can do Shakespeare well.
No.
So my second choice was Orson Welles.
Yeah. I mean, he's a monstrously good talent. I mean, he's kind of frighteningly... quite a monstrous presence. I mean, his Othello and his Macbeth and all these are kind of, whoa. And you see him do a touch of evil, and he brings that kind of almost Shakespearean grandeur to it, right? Is it a touch of evil? Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and he wasn't really trained as an actor, was he?
Is that right? I think he just
did it all himself. Yeah. I mean, he picked up how to run all the cameras.
That's right.
In 2 hours from a guy named Greg Tolan, who was the cameraman of the 1940s. And Greg came to him and said, I can teach you everything in 2 hours that you need to know. And he did. And then he made Citizen Kane. That's
right. And he also did The Magnificent Ambersons, which is beautiful.
Yeah, wonderful, except for the ending.
I was listening to interviews with him after that. There was a bonus tracks on the Magnificent Ambersons DVD. And he actually said that. He said, when I set up a scene, I stand in the space and where the actor's going to be, where the action's going to be, and I put my hand up where I think the camera should be. And most times I'm right. It's just a kind of intuitive sense of how it works.
Right. Well, there was, again, another interview on Dick Cavett, who is probably one of my favorite talk show people, where he was interviewing Orson Welles, and he said, now, what does this comment mean? It says that Orson knows if the camera is in focus without being behind the camera.
Right.
And
interesting.
Orson explained it. He said, well, I know how the camera cuts. So if I see the scene, I know what's going to be in the frame and what's going to be out of the shot.
Right.
And he says, I just know that from years of experience.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, about that's a technical side, which is so important. I got that in the theatre in London and then in Paris. I worked in all sides of the theatre, and I can tell from wherever I'm sitting in the auditorium when we're putting up a play, how it's going to look in another part of the auditorium. Learning that same thing for a movie set or a TV set is another toolbox. And it's interesting, we were talking about Richard Burton earlier, but I was talking with a friend about this the other day. Elizabeth Taylor, when they were together, people would rave obviously about Richard Burton, and for good reason, but she had incredible camera technique. I mean, just segueing from what you were saying, the angle, she knew all her angles absolutely perfectly. And I think she taught Richard Burton a few things, if not explicitly, then by osmosis, because he was a theatre man and a man of the word, and she was absolutely a woman of the image, and she was just a virtuoso of that. And you can really study camera technique for actors by watching her work.
Oh, absolutely. She was a master at that.
Yeah.
And it's completely different, isn't it? Because when you're on a stage in a theater, you basically can command the whole stage.
Correct.
You're not limited to where you can walk and where you can move.
Correct.
But with
Correct.
a film, you are.
Yes.
You can't start doing your Fred Astaire routine all the way across the stage. It just doesn't work.
Can't.
You've got to stay still.
And also, Douglas, the big difference is you're not in the driving seat. The director is.
Exactly.
And later on, the editor is. That because he she decides what will be served up to the viewer. Whereas in the theater, I mean, the director can go home. I mean, he's or she's welcome to watch, but it's they've done their job, and that's also something really important, I think, for a lot of Europeans who, when they come over here to work, to make that shift and embrace that. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's not like, oh my gosh, I'm losing my agency. No, it's a different collaboration, and can be equally powerful, or more in some ways.
The one thing that I found tragic about Richard Burton was just how much alcohol he drank.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. I mean, there was a couple of interviews again on Dick Cavett where it was towards the end of his life, and he was barely in his 50s, and he looked wrecked. I mean, physically a wreck.
You have to have a constitution of iron to be able to destroy yourself in that way. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? I mean, I don't know about you, but I mean, if I drank, a tenth of what he drank, I wouldn't last a few weeks,
I'd be in the hospital, I think.
Right. Yeah. So it's this kind of strange gift he had. I mean, he's extremely gifted, and he had this very strong constitution. He was the son of a Welsh miner, and he came from a village, and he never forgot his roots, and he had that kind of strong stock. But with it came this other side, which is really, it is tragic. You're right, a shame.
Yeah, it is. So let's shift this over. So you're not actually promoting anything at this point. I'm looking on here. You don't have a film or a TV show or anything you do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the midst, and actually this week I'm working on a Shakespeare, which is really exciting. I'm working with a young filmmaker, Aslan Daljic, on a film treatment of Julius Caesar, and we'll be filming it this month. We're in the rehearsal phase at the moment, and it's an opportunity for me to revisit a role I played in a feature-length film, Julius Caesar 2014, where I played that same role. And I'm coming back to it a few years later, and I'm telling you, Douglas, it's incredible to come back to a role. I'm seeing things I never saw before. It's like it's a new role completely. It's really interesting.
How do you mean?
Well, first of all, when you plunge into a big piece like that, you've got to get past that level of overwhelm of just the amount of thoughts and feelings and actions that come to you from all these lines. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of lines, and each one of them, kind of occupies you. Coming back to it, it's like Gary Oldman once said, it's not how well you know the lines, it's how long you've known them. And I think he's right.
That's interesting.
The longer you know, because they kind of rattle around different parts of you over the years. And you don't know it, because I wasn't working on the role of Caius Cassius for years on end. Although I use it for auditions, or I use it to create a character inside of me from time to time. But now coming back to it explicitly, I'm realizing I didn't really know this character before. I mean, not like I'm beginning to see him now. Or maybe I don't think it's a different character. I think I'm just seeing, maybe I just touched the tip of the iceberg before.
It's interesting because Orson Welles said in that interview that every great Shakespearean actor has, at one time or another, came on stage and given lines from a different Shakespearean play than they were actually performing.
Oh,
that the lines just got mixed up, he said, is because of the rhythm of the way that it's spoken.
Yes.
So he might have come out and they were doing King Lear and he did a line from Othello or something like that.
Yeah, I can believe it. I can believe it. I don't know if that's happened to me per se, but I can see it. I could see that happening very easily. So that's kind of occupying my inner world, if you like, these days, and I'm really grateful for that, because I find that Shakespearean language has a kind of vigor about it, and maybe it is the rhythm that it just makes you more vigorous when you have it in you. It makes you kind of ebullient in a strange kind of way. It's kind of life-giving. And I guess music might be that for you, right?
If it's good music, it can have the opposite effect if it's bad music.
Yeah, fair play. Did you ever, do you know the story of Julius Caesar, at least the idea of it, or the plot, as it were?
The assassination, yeah.
Right. So it's essentially the story of the conspiracy and assassination of Julius Caesar, and then what happens afterwards. And then the conspirators think they're doing something to sort of save the country and the empire or whatever, and then it all goes horribly wrong, and the lead conspirators end up killing themselves to escape the dishonor of defeat and capture in the civil war that results from their assassination. So it is really a tragedy, and even though it's called Julius Caesar, the main character is really Brutus, who's this guy with noble intention, but then he gets involved in an assassination and he can't somehow reconcile himself with it, and at the same time also it has very bad effects in the world. Like I say, it creates a civil war and all that. So it's that classic tragic thing of a fatal flaw or a fatal mistake, and it's almost like his mistake is being too naively honorable, and naive being the operative word, because he gets involved in an assassination. So I think it has once again, Shakespeare speaks to all times.
Well, it's true. I mean, you could apply that almost to what's going on in the Ukraine right now.
For example,
example,
sadly.
in an odd sort of way, although
Yeah.
Both Zelensky and Putin are still alive at this point.
Yeah, it's a terrible situation. It's so hard because it's just blowing up now that to even sift through what information people are getting in different places. I mean, that's what I mentioned at the beginning. You get the mainstream media, and now you've got people just going onto social media and TikTok and whatnot and showing, this is what's happening on my blog right now, this kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, people just shooting with their phone out of their apartment window, and you see bombs dropping in the car park, and I mean, it's it's a nightmare.
Yeah, so it's. I wonder about that also. What's the role of an artist in time? In times of I was about to say in times of change, but when is it not a time of change? Honestly, somewhere in the world or in some part of the world you live in, it's always there. So what's the role? And I mean, if you look at Shakespeare himself, I mean, it seems coming back to that, all his plays had to go past the Master of the Revels, which was basically the state censor. So he wasn't exempt either from that.
You mean back in those days they had censors as well? Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, to give you an example, I mentioned Richard II earlier. That's a role that I played and I love very much. It's the story of a king who gets deposed, or did he abdicate? This sort of question that hangs over the play. And that play was produced in Shakespeare's time at a time when there was a crisis of Elizabeth I's reign. There were things going on. There was a moment where the Essex Rebellion happened. And Essex, who led that rebellion, who was basically a favourite of the Queen who fell out of favour or wanted more than he was being given, he raised an army and tried to do a coup, a coup d'etat. And you know what he did? The night before his rebellion, he paid Shakespeare's company to perform Richard II. So it's like,
that was clever.
He was trying to whip up popular support. He was trying to show, and Queen Elizabeth got it. She said to one of her counselors, "Do you not know that I am Richard II?" Can you imagine? It's like, can you imagine that today? Like a head of state turning around saying, "Do you not know I am whatever Hollywood character that's being played?" It's like Star Wars or Marvel is actually referring to something that's going on today, that kind of thing.
Yeah, they don't. Yeah. I mean, in some ways they did. And I'm thinking of Star Trek, the original series, where they had the United Federation of Planets and then the Klingon Empire, which was obviously the Russians because they used names like Captain Koloff and, they really didn't hide the fact that this was what was going on in the real world with the Cold War at that point. So they just transformed it. So there was a bit of that, maybe not quite as in-depth as Shakespeare took it. But
yeah, I see. Do you not think that it's also just a human sort of tendency to always create a big bad army on the other side? Whether they, whether they're Russian or from, Lord of the Rings and, all these sort of epic stories have that, the fight of good and evil and all that.
Well, that's been our story as human beings since we've been human beings.
Mm-hmm.
There's been conflict on this planet forever.
Right.
And obviously it shows no sign of letting up at this point. No. And it's only going to get worse, I think, unfortunately. But I mean, that's what we're about. We're about conflict. We're about, and it's too bad. This sort of, I know it sounds a fantasy, if you will, a utopia where we all just hold hands and sing Kumbaya.
Right.
The world is not there yet. And when you have players, actors, if you will, like Putin and Xi Jinping and the North Korean, what's his name? Kim Jong-un.
Right.
People like that on the planet who are of the old world, who still see territorial capture and advancement and expansionism and increasing their power, increasing their sphere of influence. I mean, this is something that has been going on since the Bible.
Absolutely.
That mindset, okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
I mean,
well, even to a lesser degree, I mean, the United States was, the white people came and took it over from the natives and stole all their land and set up their great country.
Totally.
So that has been going on forever. And I think that when people make film or art or anything that reflects that, it's a very relevant topic that I think most people can relate.
Yes, I do think so. I mean, it's interesting when you look at some of these stories that, we're all, in a way, whether we like it or not, we're basically all the result of the stories we've sort of ingested over the years, whether it's just accidentally because of what's on TV or whether we've gone out of our way to read books or whatever. Like I mentioned Lord of the Rings before, Tolkien, he fought in the First World War and, lived through the Second World War. And you can see, obviously, the Second World War had a very clear, obvious villain or villainous axis. But other times it looks very subjective, doesn't it? I mean, I don't want to suggest that today it's so subjective, but I think there have been times when you could say, well, both sides aren't lily white in their morals, and they're both going, they're all the empire period of Europe when they basically all were fighting each other for bits of the planet. I mean, who was right, who was wrong? I don't think anybody was right in a very objective way. They were just grabbing land, in Africa and all over the place.
Well, it's true. And now, with the colonies that used to be in Africa have all been sort of eaten up by the Chinese. So where the British and the French, when they were kicked out, when all these little African countries got their independence in the 60s, the Chinese started moving in. And now there's just massive Chinese manufacturing and exploitation of all the minerals and resources of Africa. And they're getting rich off the backs of the, slave labor, if you will. Mm. And so, has the torch been passed? I don't know.
No, I don't know either. And I mean, I think there are really big questions of voice as well. Like, whose voice is being heard? Like, for example, August Wilson, the African-American playwright, he wrote actually Fences, that was a movie that came out a few years ago with Denzel Washington, Viola Davis, a very good movie. he had this big speech about common ground about 20 years ago, or 96, I think it was. He was basically saying to the sort of Anglo-Saxon or white world, look, yes, you have your stories, they're fine, but we have other stories, and we don't want to be just bit parts in your stories. We want to tell our stories. We don't have to pretend we have common ground. And I think there's a lot to be said there, because just giving space for different voices is already a huge effort. But when you do that, you shake up all the references. Like you said, I mean, now it's much more recognized that basically the European settlement of North America was at the expense of a whole people. But it didn't used to be. That was a sideline for decades or centuries, wasn't it? So, you know, that's a kind of time also we're living in, where the sort of who's being given a voice is changing a lot.
Well, okay, it's a good point that you bring up, and I'll reference this to what's going on in Ukraine, because I think at this point, most Americans who have somewhat of an open mind understand that what happened in the United States with taking all the land from the indigenous people was wrong. Okay? Unfortunately, it can't be undone at this point. So it's just a part of history, like slavery. Okay? Slavery, I don't think there's too many people that you're going to get that are going to be on the pro-slavery side of the argument. I think most people understand that that was a bad situation. It was a bad thing. It was a terrible thing that was done. And there is a sense of remorse and regret. All right? Fast forward to what's happening now. I don't think there's any remorse or regret, and there ever will be, as far as Vladimir Putin is concerned. I don't think he cares how many people die. And that has been shown to be true with all of those types of, with Stalin, with Mao. They killed millions of their own people. There was no remorse. That was just business. That's all it was. And, you know, if you were to ask the average Russian citizen now, how is all this going to improve your life? I don't think they'd have an answer for that. They'd say it won't.
I don't think you can,
No. So I think in this case, I don't hear too many people on the side of Putin and justifying what he's doing in Europe. I don't think there was that many. I'll tell you what, there was probably more people on the side of Hitler at the early stages, because he rallied the German people around him and using the Jews as a scapegoat, and how they were ripped off, if you will, during the First World War, and this was a terrible thing, and we need to reclaim our rights and our place in society and the world, right? And he did have support from a lot of, you know, screaming Nazis and people in Germany at the time. Everyone else thought he was a lunatic, but he did have that core. I don't think Putin has the support of the Russian people.
I don't know, Douglas. You know, it's very hard to know what is being projected in Russia. And I hear you. I definitely hear, you know, your point, and I hear where you're going with it. But I don't know. I cannot say for sure what people are receiving in terms of information.
Well, that's a whole different story. Kind of thing. That's a whole different story, because I know for what I've seen that they're receiving all sorts of ridiculously absurd information. They're saying that the Ukrainians are Nazis, and that there was this atrocities of human rights violations going on in the Ukraine, and Putin is coming in as the savior. I mean, this is what they're telling on Russian TV.
Well, it's you know, one thing, it's what we see, and I think it's really good that it's very uncomfortable, you know, when we're in our Western situation where we have a lot of freedom on a daily basis. I mean, relatively. It's very uncomfortable to be faced with these huge moral situations where you say, like, imagine you have Russian friends and they grew up in Russia and they're loyal to their country, as anybody might be, and they sincerely believe all these things, and then they're being shaken in their beliefs. It's like you've always got these, you know, you've got the movement of people, and you've got the heads of state taking decisions, and everybody else has to suffer the consequences. And then you've got individuals, like you speak about the Second World War. I mean, about, you know, the rise of Hitler and so on. how many Jewish people moved to the United States, and in fact enriched the United States vastly. They wrote the screenplays of movies and, all this kind of thing. So it's like, I think on an individual level, you have to kind of decide for yourself what you're going to do. And then there's on the mass level where sometimes you just don't have any choice. I mean, think how many Russians are conscripted. They're in because they have national service, don't they? So a lot of these young guys are being sent to Ukraine, and they may be told all sorts of things. But I think it works for all of us. Like, you look at the political situation in the US right now, and I often wonder about where is politics for you or for me, because I sometimes think it's just local, actual politics. So the rest it's a shot in the dark. It's a message in a bottle. I mean, I'm not saying I don't vote. I definitely vote. I think it's really wrong if you're in a democracy not to use that. But am I going to have more impact locally? Probably. Am I going to have more impact if I use my voice as an actor or as a director? Yes. And I don't mean as a sort of tub-thumping platform, you know what I mean? Like not to twist it into something else, but to do my thing on an individual level, because I feel like on the mass level, we're just subject to these forces we can't control.
I agree with you. The one thing I would say about the idea of the Russian people being supportive of Putin or not is that, and I'll tie this back to the media that we were talking about, 5 hours earlier? How long have we been on now?
I don't know.
But where everyone has a phone, everyone is connected to the internet, they can see what's going on in the entire world. Okay, right. So the Russian people, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, have seen what's on the other side of the rainbow. In World War II, they had not. Mm-hmm. So there really was this more mystique about what was going on. And their local politics, yes, was it. That's all they knew. And on a bigger scale to their country, okay? It is possible to love your country and hate your government.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think that's the story of humanity, really. I mean, it doesn't mean you always hate your government, but there's always that discrepancy, isn't there?
Yeah, so the Russian people certainly can be proud of their country and despise Putin and what he's doing at the same time.
But I think it does beg the question, though, somebody couldn't be in power if they were always hated. But the reason I'm kind of taking a side is that I don't want to make it sound like the Russians are just sheepishly following somebody. I think that there may be reasons for being supportive of the government that we don't see, and they may ultimately be misguided. But I think that Russia is a vast country with a great history. They're very educated. All the Russians I meet in the West are all, they all know how to play piano or dance, or they've all read a lot and things like that. They often put us to shame with their education. So they're not stupid, but somehow they're coming from a different place. And also, they've just been through a huge upheaval. They just communism ended in 1989, 1990, and it's a new Russia. And there's all this wealth came in, and I don't know. So I think that one would have to really study it to understand how on earth we got to where we are today.
I think you're making it more complex than it needs to be. I think you've got one dictator in Russia who has complete power and who has this sociopath personality and this one purpose that he wants to take it back to the way it was when the line was drawn at Yalta. That's really what he wants. And he doesn't care. He doesn't care how many people die. He doesn't care what it looks like. In the end, he wants that map of Europe redrawn back to 1945. He was quoted as saying that the day that the Soviet Union collapsed was the biggest tragedy of the 20th century.
Is that right?
Yeah, he was very famously quoted as saying that. And he's never lost sight of that objective. If he could have his way, he would put it back to the way it was.
Did you see, there was a documentary Werner Herzog did interviewing Gorbachev in his last years. I saw it on a plane once. It's quite recent, it's a few years. It's really good. because it really puts you inside the mind of. I mean, Gorbachev was different. I mean, he actually was one of the engineers of Perestroika, wasn't he?
Oh yeah.
And he was actually I think he was a very sound person from what I get from this. And yet you also see into a whole culture that one doesn't necessarily understand at first. And, you know, how it works. I visited Russia in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, and in St. Petersburg, I was just there for a week in St. Petersburg. It's a beautiful city. I saw older ladies, what they call babushkas, holding up these little placards saying, "We lost our father, bring back Joseph." Stalin. Because they, you know, in the new Russia, their pensions disappeared, because there was economic chaos for a while. And I'm not saying these old ladies wanted all the things that Stalin did, but for them, he was this sort of father figure who basically organized society, gave them pensions, all this kind of thing. But, you know, I almost feel like we're getting so deep into this conversation, I almost feel like we ought to have a Russian at the table. You know what I mean? Because I think there are parts of the puzzle we need to know. And I take your point. I don't mean to overcomplicate this, but I keep thinking, you know, how on earth can it have got to here? The Russians are not stupid.
Yeah, but it's not up to them. That's my point.
Point taken.
It's Putin, and that's it. End of story. Yeah. We've only got about 2 minutes, but I want to just say one quick thing here, and then we'll finish this off. We'll have you back, part 3, 4, 5, whatever.
Sounds good, Douglas.
I saw an interview that they did with, his name was Mikhail something, and he was a former advisor for Putin years ago, worked for him for 5 years, something.
Yes.
And he said that Putin is the only power in Russia, because they were talking about, we're going to sanction all the oligarchs, right?
Right.
And there was some stories on the news about they seized one of these guys' yachts or something like that. And he laughed, and he said, you could take all their money, all their yachts, it doesn't make any difference. They have no control. They have no authority. And then he made a really funny analogy. He said, it would be like if the United States invaded Canada and Canada suddenly started taking away Bill Gates's money. He said, what would that do? It would do absolutely nothing.
Right.
So these oligarchs that people think they have so much power don't. He's saying Putin is it. Putin is a dictator. End of story. So
interesting. It's funny because we started talking about Julius Caesar, which was a struggle.
It all comes back in a circle. Yeah. Caesar.
I mean, one of the things that one of the conspirator Cassius, who I play, says, he says that for my single self, I had as lief not be as live to be in awe of such a thing as I myself. In other words, he'd rather not be alive than be in awe of another man. So there's this fundamental. You know, he starts his speech saying, well, honor is the subject of my story, and I cannot tell what you and other men think of this life. But he ends up basically saying he'd rather die than be in awe of another man. So it sounds very, very good, and he uses that to whip up Brutus's emotions so that he'll join him in a conspiracy. But basically, it's coming from a place of jealousy. And you see that in these political movements, like Brutus says, okay, I'll join the plot and we'll kill the tyrant. But he's being the instigator of the conspiracy. Cassius is basically jealous that Caesar is more important than him. So it cannot come to good. And that's the thing that, you know, when I see that Julius Caesar was no Putin, but he had become the sole power, and they wanted to bring that down. They didn't want a king. I mean, that's the story of the United States, isn't it? But then what happens when somebody is it human nature? You know, are we pack animals after all? And that there'll always be one who gets to be number one. And if they kind of get stuck there, then the results are what we're seeing unfold now. So there's this constant fight to stop somebody becoming absolutely powerful.
Yes, and, you know, I think the takeaway for this is that it's not about the Russian people. It really has nothing to do with them. Unfortunately, they're just the pawns in the game, and Putin is the king at this point.
Exactly. Yeah.
And there's one last word, and then we'll wrap this up. The media has been using the term crazy to describe Putin, and I would disagree with that term. He is not crazy, he's evil, and there's a difference. Evil people and crazy people are two different people.
Yes, crazy is a get-out card, isn't it?
Well, crazy is generally someone who is crazy is erratic, impulsive. They operate on the spur of the moment. Evil people are meticulous, methodical. They plan, sometimes for years, what they're going to do. This isn't something that Putin just woke up yesterday and said, I think I'm going to invade Ukraine today. No. This has been on his mind for a long time. And he just found the right opportunity in the right moment. So there's nothing crazy about Putin. He's perfectly in control of his faculties. He's a demon, though. He's an evil person because he has no compassion, no guilt, no remorse. I don't believe it. If he had, the reason I can say that with certainty is because if he had any of those traits, he wouldn't have gone in the first place.
Well, it's strategic, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, as you said, it's calculated.
Yeah, it's very calculated. So
putting the map back together.
So when someone is that calculating, they're not crazy. They're evil.
Right.
And on that,
point taken.
We have to wrap it up. Thank you so much for coming. My guest is Conrad Cecil, and you're not promoting anything. You just came in for a lovely chat, right?
Yes, that's right. Well, I have a lot of irons in the fire, but we'll speak about that at another point.
Do you have a website you want to give out?
Yes, actually, if you look for me on IMDb, Conrad Cecil, you'll see what I've been up to, and also I'm on all social media as either Conrad Cecil actor or just as my name, Conrad Cecil.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again, and we will have you back in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Douglas, with great